The resurrection, fact or fairy tale? The chocolate bunnies, jelly beans, and nasty marshmallow birds don't really do the day justice. Easter is about celebrating that Jesus brought himself back to life 3 days after suffering a horrific death. He was no magician. He was the Son of God, killed by humanity in place of humanity, so that everyone would have an opportunity to have their relationship with God restored. When Jesus walked out of his grave, he proved that by his power and grace, we could too. Now, I mean it when I say this miracle is big and important. It's not just a beautiful symbol or a story that teaches us something. It absolutely matters that Jesus Christ actually came back to life. It's so significant that the entire Bible and Christian faith rest on it. So we better have some pretty good reasons for why we believe the resurrection actually happened. Before we get into the evidence, note that evidence doesn't always equal proof. If investigators have enough trouble proving who committed a crime using the evidence they found last week, imagine how hard it is to prove the events of ancient history. However, there is evidence, and millions of Christians throughout history have used it to build a foundation of faith. Here are some of the biggest pieces of evidence for Jesus' resurrection. First of all, not only were Jesus' own followers so completely convinced that Jesus resurrected, but in 1 Corinthians 15:6, it says that after Jesus rose, he was seen by more than 500 of his followers at one time. At the time Paul wrote that, he says that most of those people were still alive. It's hard to make up a rumor of that size when that many people agree on what they saw with their own eyes. This wasn't a hallucination or wishful thinking. Hundreds of people saw Jesus after he had died, and their account should be taken seriously. Secondly, eyewitnesses were willing to suffer and die for proclaiming that they saw the living Jesus. In Acts 4 verse 20, Peter and John say, "Even under the threats of death, we cannot stop telling about everything that we have seen and heard." The disciples and the others who followed witnessed Jesus die in the most gruesome way. And then 3 days later, Jesus appeared to them alive. And they even touched where the nails were in his hands and feet. There's a very interesting side of the story about the religious leaders being afraid that the disciples would try to fake Jesus' resurrection. After the video, you should read it for yourself. Matthew 27:57 to Matthew 28:15. While these other theories circulated, there was no dispute in the early church about whether or not Jesus rose. They believed it beyond a shadow of a doubt because so many people had seen him for themselves. They were willing to die for it. In fact, it is believed that almost all of the 11 disciples were brutally killed for telling people that Jesus resurrected. People aren't usually willing to die for a conspiracy they invented. Thirdly, and speaking of investigating conspiracies, if the disciples were only making things up or bending the truth, why did they allow themselves to be portrayed in the Bible as scared, weak, and flawed? They were a motley ragtag bunch of misfits, and they make no effort to be remembered any differently. Certainly not as any sort of heroes. Additionally, if the disciples were trying to convince people that Jesus came back to life, they would not have used the first-hand account of the 2 women who went to visit the tomb. At that time, a woman's account of events was not considered trustworthy over a man's. So if they wanted anyone to believe their lie, they would have recorded that it was men who found the tomb empty. Instead, we find a story told truthfully and a record of events that took place exactly as remembered. Now, I'll warn you that there's always going to be some people who, no matter how much evidence they're presented with, will not believe in the resurrection, because it does, admittedly, contradict the laws of nature. People don't just come back to life. But does that mean they can't? Is it foolish for a Christian to believe in an otherwise impossible miracle made possible by the all-powerful God, who literally wrote the laws of nature? I love the way Paul defends the resurrection in Acts 26 verse 8. Why does it seem incredible to any of you that God can raise the dead? So maybe we shouldn't be so surprised that the amazing God who created the universe can also bring himself back to life. But if you ever do find yourself struggling with doubt and you wish you could have been there to see Jesus die and rise again with your own eyes, remember what Jesus told Thomas, the disciple who doubted the resurrection even after all his friends told him that they saw Jesus. John 20:29. You believe because you have seen me. Blessed are those who believe without seeing me.